Autoloaders clicked on cyclical. He swiveled. The paralyzed bulk of his las cannon arms tingled gently where machine fiber was sutured to flesh nerves. His name was Gunner 156X, but the maintenance slave jokingly referred to him as Sternface. The world outside was boundless and black, and possible for him to understand. Cocooned against the universe. Oh, wow. Human eyes attuned to nothing but signature scans. He locked onto a target, a sudden blip on the auspex. He framed it under target lock for a brief second, and then it was gone. Wires thrummed and electricity coursed through his veins. His focus was singular. In the distance, he heard the deep throb of celebration as the blood gorgons reveled. There was the sound of the ship's auspex system sweeping the regional asteroids, bypassing debris and the looming nearby moons. He heard all these things, but his focus remained singular. Gunner 156X was a gun servitor. His sole reason for existence was the functioning Las Blister 156X, a six-stack las cannon turret. A tiny pore on the oceanic hide of the cauldron born. He was hardwired, his fleshy torso plugged in at the hip into a swivel turret, and his arms amputated by the triple pod las cannons affixed to his shoulder sockets. There, a single target. Multiple targets. Sizable threat. Cruiser-sized craft and shoals for escorts. A swarm of unknown predators encircling the Leviathan bulk of the cauldron born. With a domino effect, defense blisters and lance ports all reported the same active reading. The entire starboard sector came alive with warning. Gunner 156X suddenly felt alive. This was the only time that it remembered the human concept of excitement. He swiveled his las stack, locking onto the approaching fleet. They were far too away for him to see, but he could feel them like cold pricks on his skin from the ship's hard-plugged monitors. All automatic defenses stand down. All automatic defenses stand down. Gunner 156X paused. His muscles twitched. Where the locking clamps of the turret connected to his shoulder, he itched. He waited for the override authorization. Defense system down. Authorization, Lord Anko Moore. Moore. Gunner 156X brought up his memory banks. Moore was the master now. He knew his hand had not always been the case. This had been another one, but the information had been blanked out, changed. His machine mind could never bring up that data again. Authorization cleared. As the unknown fleet lurked closer, Gunner 156X powered down, simultaneously alone, with all the ship's defenses. That's a little bit later on. I just opened up that page and it drew me in. Formation! Gamadin shouted at his impassives. The impassives tightened into a defensive shell around Gamadin. In a circle, they fired into the incoming avalanche of thrashing limbs, flashing bursts of ammunition into the mob. The horde rushed into and directly over the blood gorgons. Naked bodies collided against the anchored warriors, bouncing off their solid weight and swarming around them like an estuary. "We are being fired upon," Fox Bond Brother Carcosa, as he closed a hand to his suddenly bleeding neck. "We are receiving fire," Kadath affirmed, as panicked bodies drummed and bumped against him. From the distant slopes, a high-pitched whistling could be heard as high-velocity missiles whipped through the grass. They came from every direction at once, slicing into the enamel of his armor. It was an indiscriminate volley, slicing down the fleeing humans as it ricocheted against their plate. Gamadin magnified his vision threefold towards the slopes. He saw thin humanoids in dark blue carapace standing up from the grass, darkening from position to position. They raised long rifles and moved with the fluid coordination of trained marksmen. Gamadin recognized their attackers as Dark Eldar and knew there was treachery on this world. He threw the Tolwar blade in his palm underhand. The heavy dagger shot out in a wide arc before meeting a Dark Eldar almost 40 meters away, sending it sprawling into the grass. Before his blade had found its target, Gamadin had already picked out several shots with his combi bolter. The mag scope of his vision lens spun and whirled as it tracked multiple targets before seeking a new one. As Gamadin put them down, his rage was building. A Xenos round, a crystallized shard of poison, sliced through the back of his knee joint. The toxin tingled into the wound, potent enough to have immediately paralyzed any normal human being. The wound only enraged Gamadin more, his killing becoming methodical as he picked target after target. The eight impassives fanned out to lay down a curtain of fire. Like Gamadin, they were not pressured to shoot wild. Even as constant shred of Dark Eldar weaponry hummed through the air, they picked their shots. The blood Gorgons refused to give ground, despite the fleeing humans who were added to the confusion. Growing bold, the Dark Eldar emerged from the grass to charge down the sandy gradient in the ragged line. A grenade went off at close range, shaking the world and jetting up sheets of mud. Gamadin's withdrawal was being cut off. The Dark Eldar hooked around their flanks. As the stampede of captives blocked and hemmed in the impassives, Gamadin nearly lost his footing in the treacherous mud as the storm of Xenos weaponry thickened considerably. Splitter rifles ripped shot against the flat mud, steaming up a fog of dirt particles. The airborne mud hung in swirls and lazy drifts, choking the blood Gorgons' targeting systems. "We must withdraw," Gamadin vouched over the squad link. As they fell back, the Dark Eldar pressured them, staying in their pocket and exchanging a blizzard of shots. Brother Sergeant Albausis and his brother Garn, moved to intercept the Dark Eldar, flanking the pincer on their left, banging off crisp, precise shots. Garn had been blinded in the firefight, his helmet discarded and his eyes shorn by shrapnel. Abeslis cried out coordinates to the sightless Garn, directing his bolter wherever the enemy gathered to return fire. Movement was the only thing that prevented the blood Gorgon from being pinned in the open. Gamadin, still facing the enemy, moved backwards to the lake. His combi bolter was spent of bolt shells. The Dark Eldar chased him, daring to rush so close to Gamadin that he could see the vision slits of their helmets. Easily excited, the Dark Eldar were growing careless in their pursuit. Gamadin raised his right hand, the monstrous chitin of his pincer, and caught them as they lunged in. With his left, he expelled the last of his flamer. The Dark Eldar, caught in the high-pressure stream, shrieked and died loudly, their inferior carapaces charring under the chemical fire. Capable of stripping paint off tank hide in its raw form when ignited, the paltromic acid burned to a glowing white 2,000 degrees. Within seconds, the Dark Eldar were melted into stumps of fused plating and flesh. Corrosive fumes billowed in a thick, cloying raft, driving back those Dark Eldar who were hounding Gamadin so closely. Behind Gamadin, Brother Sergeant Kadath, Carcosa, and Blood Captain Hammurabi escorted Moore, who was extracting Nargil's Jane seed with his scissor hands. The trio surrounded the witch surgeon, firing outwards as they fought their way towards Gamadin. A Dark Eldar raider, too confident in his own abilities, darted low at Hammurabi, twin blades trailing. The ancient captain dismissed him with a backhanded slap, breaking the Dark Eldar's neck, while he continued to cycle through his bolter. Kaldith suddenly fell, his neck ruptured. Carcosa caught him by his bolter sling and dragged him backwards. Gamadin melted the last of his flame chambers as he watched the Dark Eldar close in. How many of them were there? Hundreds? Certainly, judging by the bodies that were beached on the shores. The remaining impassives, their bolters now slung, slaughtered their way deep into the lake with mace, axe, and hammer. They drove a path to the Dark Eldar, who tried to engage them in hand-to-hand. For all the speed and deft blade skill of the Xenos raiders, the impassives crushed them with brute strength. Bond brother Gemostos led the way, sprinting at full speed, and 300 kilos of him with it. An ironclad juggernaut crashed to the Dark Eldar, swinging his antlered helm from side to side. Together, the impassives clustered around Gamadin like a shield wall. They became a solid phalanx of ceramite. The Dark Eldar could not maneuver close enough to surround them. Bolt shells whistled and spat through the water grass. And that was when Mur revealed his hand. Trailing behind, the witch moved away from his lord. The dark Eldar around him did not strike nor fire upon him, even as he raised his hand to summon his powers. A sudden wind gusted across the river, flattening the grass on the banks as it reached the highest pitched crescendo. Witch! Shouted Gamadin. What matter? Gamadin was cut short as Mur clapped his hands. The air pressure dropped as if in vacuum. Shadows began to rise out of the boiling current, humanoid in shape, with multiple reaching hands. The water frothed violently around the impassives. Shadowy apparitions bubbled forth from the river and began to swarm over them. The mud beneath the Chaos Marine's feet gurgled wetly, slipping and sliding as if falling away. Mur! You are not worthy of Blood Gorgon title! Gamadin whispered on the squad link. The lake bottom suddenly imploded with a thunderous gurgle. It yawned like a sinkhole, thirstily draining water into its aqueous abyss. Four impassives were carried down by the crushing flood of water. Gamadin sank down on one knee, fighting for purchase in the mud, warning lights flashing across his vision as the whispering spirit of his armor began to babble nonsense in his ears. The ground beneath him continued to give way. Sensing his weakness, warp hounds began to paddle across the lake towards him. I have plenty left for you, he roared, drawing a scimitar from his back scabbard. The pitted blade was almost 2 meters in length, scarred and nicked from centuries of service. It resembled a tool rather than a blade, a piece of metal stripped of any elegance in favor of the utility of killing. Dragging it to his left, he met the charging hounds, with 3 horizontal strikes, rushing past him as they leapt into the air, leaving severed corpses in his wake. As he turned to meet Mur, the betrayer, the sorcerer was wise to keep his distance, stepping away, even as his hands throbbed with black sorcerer fire. Witch! What have you done here? Gamadin demanded. You're a tiresome one, Mur replied. The Blood Gorgons need new leadership. I tire of roving like vagabonds adrift in space with no purpose. We are raiders, Mur. That is our way of doing things, growled Gamadin. He tried to raise his feet, but the lake bottom sucked and slurped. The water line lowered visibly as the champion ascendant planted his foot on the solid mud, but yet it yielded completely. The gushing water pushed against him, and suddenly Gamadin was going over. You're going to die now! It was the last thing Lord Gamadin heard as the lake swallowed up. Gamadin was dead. There were these words echoed across the cauldron born. From the fortress ship's hammerhead prow, word spread quickly of their champion's death. Cries of alarm could be heard in the ship's temple bowels, and sorrow radiated out in thousands of chambers and connected corridors of the floating fortress. The demon bells were tolled, and the ship fired broadsides in salute. Many did not believe the news. It should not, nay, it could not have happened, and some refused to accept it. Lord Gamadin had been their master when the Gorgons were first created in the 21st founding. He had been their shepherd when the Imperium declared them renegade, excommunicate traitores, mere centuries later, and it was he who had parted the warp sea to lead them to the Eye of Terror. The Blood Gorgons knew no other commander. Even the ship itself strained in mourning. As an artifact of Blood Gorgon's biological experimentation, pseudo-surgery, and demonology, all 8 kilometers of the vessel seemed to tremble. It was said that the floating fortress had been grafted with the flesh of a demon prince, and that organic matter had cultivated to merge with the ship's engines, spawning a spirit that inhabited the circuitry. Gamadin was its master, and the ship was his steed. Panic and disturbance accompanied the news of his passing. The captains of the companies, 9 in all, retreated to their lairs within the labyrinth depths, drawing around them their most trusted warriors. None knew what the following days would bring, but they knew well enough not to act in haste. Sabta, the older, chapter veteran, slipped into a berserk rage. He had been Gamadin's blood bond, having exchanged excised organs and blood with him in rituals of binding. The death of his bond drove Sabta insatiate with grief and fury. He was recorded in history when Gamadin had first begun to experiment in demonology and the rituals that would form Blood Gorgon's custom. Gamadin had been bound to his most trusted lieutenant, Monomachus. Utilizing the superhuman constitution of an Astartes, surgeons had transferred blood and nurtured organs from excised tissues into prospective bonds. Using Gamadin's knowledge of arcane lore, rituals of the forgotten were followed, creating an almost superhuman connection between those who survived the procedure. Together, Gamadin and Monomachus led the Blood Gorgons to raid and terrorize the shipping lanes of the Segmentum Obscurus. So attuned were they that in battle the pair could orchestrate intuitive tactical decisions without any communication. During the War of the Wire, Gamadin had sensed Monomachus's beleaguered disposition and sent reinforcements from two star systems away, despite the oceanic gulf of distance. For 4 centuries they fought as parallel twins until Monomachus angered the gods, and his form was corrupted into that of a spawn. It was said that Gamadin was greatly shamed by this and slew Monomachus himself, an act that would have caused him considerable physical pain. By now, Gamadin was a warrior so great, with blood so rich and vibrant, with the power of chaos, that no mere aspirant could hope to be blooded to him. Following Monomachus, numerous unsuitable aspirants were killed by the rich blood of Gamadin. Rituals of binding were dangerous, both through the traumatic shock of surgery and the whims of demonic spirits. Although Gamadin's experience was vast, he could not share it, for dozens of aspirants died or went mad in the rituals of transfusion and excise. It was not until Sabta, an inductee from the Legion Plains of Simeon, had a bond showed promise. The aspirant endured months of torture on the operating slabs, his body sent into shock by the process of plasma binding, until he emerged as a young charge of the great Gamadin. For the next 3,651 years, Sabta the Older had become Gamadin's brother, growing stronger and wiser through their synergy. And now, Gamadin was dead. The maze of Axe Marshall, a 60-hectare section of the interior combat facilities set beneath the engine decks of the Cauldron-born, was littered with corpses. Narrow ossuaries meandered into charnel houses where the bones of slain training prey filled the walls. The macabre displays formed neat lattices where bare skulls of all species formed low pyramids. Even the floors were snowy with buildup of bone powder. Each prey was released into the maze. The blood gorgons interned them where they fell, and in the preceding centuries, the blood gorgons trained often. Push to the left. The prey is on our left at 30 degrees, Sargul whispered into his vox link. But Barsabas did not need to hear the command. He could already judge by the way Sargul stood, the angle of his helmet, and the urgency in his voice, that their prey was on his left. Such was the shared experience of blood bond that Barsabas fired before he took aim through his bolter scope. So sure he was of Sargul's warning. The termagant was shredded by the salvo of shots. The plates on its forehead crumpled away as its frontal lobe exploded. Its bulbous hind legs loosened from beneath it, and the creature collapsed, its thick tail straightening. As it died, its thigh muscles continued to work, twitching and kicking the last of its life away. A kill counter chimed in the corridor, signaling a successful training shot. Perfect, Sargul said, slapping the back of Barsabas' bulgy power pack. But next time, do not wait. Aim your shot if you can spot it. Our blood bond allows us to kill efficiently together, not through some rigid singularity. Barsabas nodded intently as the blood bond spoke. Bond brother Sargul was an experienced warrior with almost 6 decades of service to his trophy racks, And although Barsabbas had been bonded to him since his early days as a neophyte, they were markedly different. Barsabbas was young, at least for a traitor marine. He had been plucked from his family as a child and survived the tests and ordeals required to become a neophyte. At the cusp of adulthood, he had been selected to bond with Sargol and survived the ritual of excise that transplanted their major organs and homogenized their blood. Since then, he had not only served as a fully fledged Bond brother on two major tours and a dozen minor raids. Physically, too, Bar Sabbas differed from his Bond. Where Sargol reached almost 250 centimeters tall at bare feet, Bar Sabbas was short for a traitor marine, topping out at 2 meters 30 in plated height. While Sargol was long in the hamstrings and forearms, Barsabbas was wide and thick in the legs. Although their differences would go unnoticed among humans who viewed all Astartes as uniform giants, a space marine perceived such subtle differences in stature and interpreted accordingly. Theirs was a mature culture, a martial culture, and Barsabbas had often felt the lesser of the bond. The pair were anything but the same. That was sharp, brothers, said Sergeant Sika. Gather on me for a post-training evaluation. The 6 traitor marines of Squad Veshpa took a knee and began to break down the entire training session from the moment of movement formations and firing patterns down to finite details of Xenos physiology and communications theory. As the youngest of the squad, Barsabbas scribbled down notes on a data slate while others listened with the casual confidence of experience. There was the pair of Hydeus and Scython, impetuous and helmetless, both displaying knife scars on their cheeks, nose, bridges, mirror scars that perfectly aligned. There was stern Sergeant Sika with his chain axe slung across his shoulders. Crouched next to him was Sika's Bond, Baal Shura, clacking his metal jaw, an augmetic replacement that had been purposefully left jagged and rough cut. The downward point of his stalactite chin cemented Baal Shura's face to a morose, forlorn grimace. The sirens on the ossuary blared again, signaling the end of the session. Having dispatched the last of their prey, the 6 members of Squad Veshpa gathered their way down the corridor towards the caged gates. They followed the trail of the dead, the remains of those they had felled that day. Most had been lower organisms of the Tyrannid genus, smaller, wiry animals that had been herded from the slave pens into the maze. The chapter had recently procured a large quantity of such creatures from Xenos slave drivers on the Edge Rift worlds, and it seemed as if every training drill since then had involved using the captured Tyrannids. In truth, Barsabbas had grown bored of killing them. At first, the flocks of skittering, agitated little creatures had been a challenge. They leapt and bounced in defiance of the ship's artificial gravity, running vertically up the walls and racing across the ceilings like paper debris ejected from a venting pipe. But it had not taken Barsabbas long to recognize their patterns of movement and adapt his bolter drills accordingly. Soon the challenge of shooting them became a chore, as mere series of trajectory calculations had to be hardwired into Barsabbas' muscle memory through repetition. The trail of dead was kilometers long. The maze of Axe Marshal needed to be large in order to accommodate the training requirements of the Blood Gorgons chapter. Only in these rambling tunnels could the Blood Gorgons simulate the violent claustrophobia of a ship boarding action. A system of concentric corridors, murder holes, and dead ends. It was perfectly adapted for the ship boarding actions of the piratical renegades. The maze was so vast that slaves released into the labyrinth could hide for days, if not months, before Blood Gorgon squads could find them again. At times, the slaves would be supplied with weapons and rations so they could better mimic enemy action. It was not uncommon for slaves of higher intelligence to survive for periods of time, subsisting on fungus and condensation. They often converged into groups for survival, leaving behind the unmistakable remains of food scraps and refuse. Some lost their sanity and were driven to cannibalism. Humans and orcs were especially susceptible to such madness, prowling the maze in ghoulish packs. Barsabas led the way as the maze sirens barked again, more urgently this time. The corridors were unlit and lined with porous granite. It seemed to soak up light as well as it did blood. Relying only on the dimmest vision setting, Barsabas probed the way with his chainsword. The persistent toiling of the bells swelled, an imperious clanging. This was no longer a signal that the training drills were over, Barsabas realized. Somewhere deep within the temple heart of their ship, a call had been issued for the chapter to form. Barsabas did not know why, but he knew Sergeant Sargul echoed his confusion. The temple bells were never rung, except in the event of chapter scale war or calamity. Quickening his pace, Barsabas slashed away at a solid, gossamer curtain of spiderwebs. Through a passage that had been disused for centuries, Barsabas was not sure what was happening. Stomping through the carcass of a termagant, he treaded his way towards the ship's temple heart. Deep within the ship's core, the bells were sounding again and again, twin bells swaying ponderously as their charnel arches, pounding out gamadin's swan song. Carved from stone ore, each bell was 50 meters from crown to lip, and their echo could be heard clearly in the furthest points of the fortress ship. The blood Gorgons knew the sound as the apocalypse toll, a herald of calamity. For the past several days, the bells had been sounding at the passing of each ship's cycle. Now they were hauled into a climactic urgency to mark the summoning. Gamadin's death song would end only with the invocation of the chapter's patron demon, Yatsugi. The peal woke the dreadnoughts from their rusting slumber. The 16 dreadnoughts of the blood Gorgons shifted slippily as servitors anointed their machine joints. They were old bondsmen, some 4,000 years old, locked in their coffins of war. They had earned their rest and did not wake for petty follables. But even they recognized the apocalypse tolls. The knells radiated outward down to the ship's bows, where the blood Gorgons birthed the rare few armored machines that still were able to be maintained. These rhinos and land raiders from the ancient past were now hollowed shells inhabited by dormant spirits. At the crack of the bells, the engine demons started, their motors throaty with promethium phlegm. Some of the armored carriers jolted forwards, pulling against the shipping chains that lashed them to the decking. They growled and revved, suddenly excited like the leashed dogs straining towards bait. The cog's teeth, a rhino pattern armored carrier, broke free of its moorings and crashed into a far wall, crumpling the bulkhead. Servitors rushed forwards to calm the demon spirit within, splashing its tracks with blood to satiate its rage. Throughout the cauldron born, from the central barracks to the most crooked forgotten passages, all were summoned to the temple at the core of the cruising Leviathan. The temple matched the bells in their size and grandeur. The ribcage of a dead beast ridged the dome ceiling. Intercostal spaces were filled with personal shrines, each maintained daily by one of the 900 blood Gorgons. Some were tall and narrow, like grandfather clocks, while others were squat cubbies, brimming with offerings of spent bolter casings, ears, teeth, and baubles. The temple, the pit, the demon's cage. Moore and his coven were painting the geometrics on the marble floor with careful strokes of their ash brushes. The Turgeon witches, 9 in number, were barefoot and clad in loose black robes. They appeared as giants against the wide, featureless expanse of the marble dais, yet they painted with tiny brushes, tracing precise triangles into interconnected pentagrams. These wards have been inscribed on the domed walls too, painting via scaffolding that swayed gently in the gravitational lurch. The pit smelled of sorcery, incense burners, oil, and acidic paint, of slow, focused intensity. Myrna's witches could make no mistake. The slightest error in the wards would be unthinkable. Elusive and ever clandestine, the chapter knew to leave the witches to their own rituals. The coven were not blood bonded like their brethren, and from this there grew a rift between the witches and the companies. It was a respectful rift, but a rift all the same. Unseen by others, the witches had cleared themselves first. A ritual cleansing that washed away all their sins. The skin flies and dermabrasion left them pink and newborn, which would not give away their musk to the warp gods, or so the ritual claimed. Once the last wards were laid and the bells finished tolling, the chapter would gather for summoning. Yatsugi was an old demon, older than the Imperium, than Terra, than even men that fought with sword and shield. He was known by many names and had appeared under many guises throughout history. But he was not strong. Not strong in the way of a greater demon, or even a warlike demon prince was strong. He was a mischievous demon, a trickster. He was also a patron. He had chosen the blood Gorgons, for they, much like him, were rogues. They came to him for his prophecies and his knowledge, and he chose to humor them, for he yearned for human company. Yatsugi enjoyed the petty foibles and insignificant dramas of their short lives. When they summoned him, as they had done so for the past 3,651 years, Yatsugi roared, and his avatar materialized on the prime worlds. Yatsugi spread his arms and shrieked. In truth, he would have preferred a quiet summoning, but the humans responded well to the antics. There was a maelstrom of warp fire coalescing into a spiraling column. With a clap of crashing air, it disappeared, and Yatsugi found himself in the familiar temple heart. Pentagrammic wards crisscrossed his vision like interlaced bars of a cage. They sprouted from the wide marble floors and laced down from the domed ceiling. Beyond the dais, he could see the souls of the assembled blood Gorgons. Patron or not, Yatsugi could not deny his demon hunger. Given the chance, he would devour them all. You intrude upon my slumber again, Yatsugi caused, feigning shrill indignity. In truth, he had grown tired of the warp, and a glimpse of the prime worlds was a welcome respite. The blood Gorgon psyker, he knew as Myrrh, stepped forwards into the dais, stopping shy of the external pentagram. Yatsugi, the most grave and revered, Baron of the Reef of Terror, the deeds that you must soon hear, what sorrow you must behold, for we mourn the passing of our great champion. Yatsugi rolled his ropey shoulders. Most dreadful to hear, and even more to see. But first, loosen my bones, they are so tight. Yatsugi pretended to contort his demonic form in discomfort. Mur crouched down and brushed a line away with his hand. Pigment came away from the marble on his palm. On his hands was a tiny smear, almost imperceptible, considering the immense size of the marking, but it broke an external seal. It was a calculated risk, but a dangerous one at that. Yatsugi knew the humans needed something from him, and Mur did not dare to antagonize him. He had other plans. Yatsugi felt his confines loosen ever so slightly. Their souls grew brighter to him. The demon stretched languidly. Ah, how these bones make me weary! He yawned and opened one eyelid coyly. Perhaps you could loosen another? So you say, Mur replied coldly. He stepped back from the dais. The witch was no fool, and he knew better than to trust a demon. Although Yatsugi was their chosen patron, he was a deity, and they were mere humans. He appeared to Mur as a leaping shade, narrow-waisted and smoky, with horns that formed an intricate crown atop his head, a towering pillar of unreality, a thing from another existence. They trusted him for his prophetic knowledge, but not for their lives. Amuse me, then. What favor would you crave of me? Mur cleared his throat. Lord Gamadin is dead. Yatsugi yawned. How did Gamadin die? Mur lowered his head solemnly. Lord Gamadin
and his warrior few embarked across the warp sea to claim a new slave world for harvest. But the pirates of Eldar kind had long ago colonized this world in secret. They were prepared, and the battle was their theater, their stage. We were ambushed and fought on their grounds. I was the only survivor. Yatsugi steepled his fingers and fixed his eyes on the witch. Mura was a good liar, and it was clearly a story he had rehearsed and no doubt recounted many times. But the demon could see deception against the fabric of reality. Although this was the story Mura had told the chapter, Yatsugi knew the witch was hiding his own involvement. Yes, so you speak of his demise. That is not your present plight, the demon purred. It appears not the death of an old champion, merely that you present a new one to the gods. Gamadin has appointed me sole guardian in his stead, Mur recited. The demon knew this must be a lie too. There were other factions at play here, and Mur was simply one such cog in the machine. But Yatsugi did not reveal Mur's lie. He would enjoy whatever plot was to unfold. Tell me, witch, how did he die? The demon baited. Slain by treachery. That was the truth this time. Yatsugi smiled. I challenge that claim, said a low voice. The witch has no proof. Yatsugi knew the voice. Sabta. The demon clapped with glee. The bond of Gamadin! Come forth, come forth! Sabta stepped onto the dais from his audience. Yatsugi could see the raw aggression rippling from the old warrior. The wardenship is mine to hold, he stated boldly. So it should be, Yatsugi agreed, straining against the circle of ash and paint. As he writhed, paint faded from the walls, and several of the words disappeared from the marble. His constraints were breaking. Souls grew brighter and brighter. Then denounce this man as a liar, Sabta said, stabbing his forefinger at Mur. Yatsugi cocked his head. I sense the witch has some power. A foreign power. Perhaps Gamadin has given you this power, or perhaps another? Yatsugi could tell Mur was beginning to wither from his attention. The witch was being influenced by greater powers, a rival patron perhaps? There was something more to this tale. Gamadin had not simply been slain by the Dark Eldar by accident, leaving the witch as a sole survivor. Mur's eyes narrowed defiantly, as if sensing Yatsugi's intent. Gamadin chose me. Biding his time, the demon leaned forwards and smiled at the witch and the old wolf. You must enthrone an ascendant champion. Hear me, this. Do not displease the gods, or there will come bad spirits, and they will snatch good fortune from you. Biding his time, the demon leaned forward and smiled at the witch and the old wolf. You must enthrone an ascendant champion. Hear me this. Do not displease the gods, or there will come bad spirits. They will snatch good fortune from your grasp. Yatsugi was cracking the seals now. He strained against his weakened confines. He hungered for their souls. Reaching out with his hand, Yatsugi beckoned Mur closer. Demon, be gone! Mur shouted. Suddenly, as if angered, he dispelled the coven's bindings and unraveled the demon back to the warp. There was a swirl of cold, and the wards blackened to ash.
On the first day of Swelter, in the central territory of Hatzbasik, herdsmen of the Plagues were mustering their caprid for early morning drove. When they looked up, they saw a dark ochre cloud hidden amongst the swells of the light dawn culminus. It was the color of powdered groundnut, and seemed to have the same grainy texture. Heavy and brooding, the strange cloud spread out and descended to cap the distant ridges. The herdsmen thought little of it, rushed, as they were, to return to their kinships with cappered milk for breakfast. There was something about the cloud that troubled them. The season of swelter brought with it a brutally dark sky, bathed almost white by the harsh suns. By morning, the red clouds of the plains would be hot enough to curdle lizard eggs. Seldom did the storms come until evening, and even then only briefly. When the cloud landed, first away from their eyes, it began to kill. More clouds, like it, soon followed, and the microfauna began to die first. Across the plains and dunes of Basik, beneath a layer of red iron and oxidized dust, ore beetles shriveled up into husks and died. The microscopic filling worms that inhabited the top layer of ferric sand writhed in toxic pain, burrowing deeper to no avail. The clouds savaged the earth. Distant Ur, the sealed city, cocooned its gates and weather shields against the encroaching clouds. For as long as Ur stood, it had been sealed and silent against the outside, opening only intermittently to trade with the plains nomads. Now it sealed itself permanently. A light southerly carried the fumes across the dry clay seas and dispersed the poison across the lower part of the continent. Ancient baobab trees, whose swollen trunks and leafless branches had survived centuries of remorseless sun and drought-sickened visibility, their silver bark peeling like wet skin. Across sheltered gorges that had resisted the climate, patches of coral brush and cacti wilted upon contact. Only when the clouds began to affect the caprid herds did the plainsmen become concerned. The leaping caprid was the lifeblood of the Basik kinships. In past ages, when the mining colonies of distant Terra had harvested the ferrous-rich planet of Hots Basik, these goat antelopes had been brought with them as a hearty food source. It had been a wise choice, for the horned bovids proved remarkably resilient in the scorching desert, surviving off runt flora while providing the settlers with milk and meat. Even when the colonists began to leave Basik, abandoning its ultraviolet heat and its isolation from the Imperium, the caprid flourished. With their musterers gone, they escaped their pens and became wild, their numbers multiplying. The industrial mines fell silent, and the colonists who remained there were too few to operate the earth movers or tectonic drills. Some retreated to the walled city of Ur and sealed themselves against the heat, drought, and radiation. Their fates became unknown, their envoys only emerging from their sealed city to trade. An isolationist imperial cult, Ur became a forgotten bastion of the early colonists. Many others wandered the plains in loose familial bonds known as kinships, gathering petrochemicals in a vain attempt to keep their machines running and resist their decline into savagery. Soon the Imperium had forgotten its scorched thermal planet of Hots Basik, and Basik in turn forgot the Imperium. Even then, the caprid remained a key factor for their survival. From their shaggy, long hair sheared in the swelter seasons, to the colonists turned plainsmen, that they could weave into. Okay, they have wool. Although official history had largely been forgotten, it was said by word of mouth from kinship to kinship that the caprid were the true settlers of Hots Basik. The animal's death was of great concern to the plainsmen. Affected caprid refused to eat, wasting away within a matter of days. The herdsmen could not bear to watch the caprid shrink until they could barely lift the thick horns of their heads, stooped and bent as they stumbled about. Before succumbing to the distance, the caprid would become aggressive. their eyes rolling wide as they bit and kicked in a frenzy. The herdsmen soon realized it was better and safer to kill any capra they suspected of being ill before they had become possessed by the ghost, as the plainsmen coined it. In due time, the sickness spread from the caprid to the plainsmen. At first, there was panic among the nomadic kinships. They sent emissaries to the north, to the only permanent settlement in the continent, to the mounds of Ur, but the city had hidden behind its walls. Blind to the fate of the wandering nomads. The denizens of Ur had never considered the plainsmen worthy of anything more than infrequent trade. Although the nomads had no central king, an elder named Sulue gathered all the wisest elders of the North Territory to discuss this great catastrophe that had befallen them. Sulue was not a king, but he was the elder of the Grandar kinship, and he owned a great many head of caprid. His position of so many herds earned him a respected place among the leaders of other kinships, and they acknowledged his word. At his request, the wisest of the northern kinships gathered to discuss the disease that was spreading so rapidly. As was custom for the plainsmen, stories were abundant. Some spoke of black skies in the extremities of the north, dark clouds that smeared the sky even during the hottest midday. Others spoke of famine and entire kinships disappearing. Others still muttered of ghosts and the restless dead. It was difficult to separate fact from fiction among the nomads' word of mouth, but it was clear that strange and frightful things were occurring. Sulaway spoke briefly of summoning the god spawn, but the elders, grave through the situation, dared not resort to such measures. In the end, nothing came to fruition from the meeting, and the elders returned to their kinships. Within 2 days, Sulaway was sick, his brain racked by fever, and his eyes rolling wide as he succumbed to a sickness he had likely contracted during the meeting of elders. He died soon after, not remembering his own name or where he was. Within a 10-day, fully half of his kinship fell ill. Even Sulaway's slight exchange with the other kinships had been enough to infect them all. Yet most frightening of all was the story of Sulaway after his death. It was passed from word of mouth to word of mouth by kinless herdsmen to the southern territories. And there were many variations of the tale, but the core of it will always remain the same. It was said that Sulaway's kin buried him in the hollowed bole of a boab tree, as custom required, and sealed the hole with many heavy rocks. They performed the ceremonial dances to calm the spirit of the plains and buried him with his war bow, hatchet, and saddle, so he would not need to seek his possessions in the afterlife. Yet, despite the precautions, Sulaway returned many days later. Here, the tale differed. For some said Sulaway returned to his kin with the eyes of white and a smile on his face, asking them for one last meal. Others spoke of Sulaway returning at dusk, a flesh-hungry ghoul who tapped on the carriages of his kin, pleading to be let in with a beguilingly sweet voice. Whatever the truth, the story spread as rapidly as the sickness. When the story reached the ears of Sulaway's brother-in-law, Chestu, an elder of Zosa kinship, it was decided that they would not wait idle. Although Chestu did not own many caprid, nor did his kinship boast many young men, the Zosa were a brave family. There was evil in the northern tip, and Chestu was resolved to ride out and find those kinships that had fallen silent there. Chestu chose 5 of his kinship's most robust men, all of them his own blood cousins. He made sure they groomed and saddled their talon squaws properly, preening black feathers of the flightless sprint birds with oil until they were glossened against the sun, and hooded their beaks in the sheaths of leather. As usual, young Hantu neglected to oil the bare legs and long neck of his bird, featherless parts, which were especially susceptible to sunburn, and Chestu had berated him furiously, dashing a clay bowl into the ground in anger. Chestu was in no mood for slothfulness at a time such as this. The riders were dispatched in dawn, before the suns grew thermal. Each man wore a shuka of brilliant red wool, a loose sarong worn by all the plainsmen across the territories. Red was a favored dye, and it would give Chestu and his riders much bravery and aggression. They rode with bows across their saddles and weighted hatchets at their hips. The kinsmen saw them off with dancing and singing, jumping up and down on the spot, to clatter their wrist bangles and necklace wreaths. The plainsmen were not a warlike people, and the departure of their warrior braves was a momentous occasion for the Xhosa. Chestu rode to the north, and that was the last time his kinship saw him. The days passed, and the riders did not come back. Chestu's wife waited for his return, watching the horizon. For as long as she watched, the sky in the distance was ominously black, contrasting with the harsh white everywhere else. Some of the clouds were pileous, rolling like caps of toxic amber. Others were low stratus clouds, coating the horizon in a flat, featureless black rind. They uncurled ponderously, boiling themselves into monster shapes that resembled faces, always creeping closer. It would not be long, she thought, until they blocked out the many suns. The temple had no name. It had no name because it was the only temple they knew. From outside, it resembled a pylon of uncarved red rock, like a rigid tooth that rose from the flat ground around it. If one were to carve away the exterior, to tear away the rust storms and ferric buildup that cocooned its outside surface, one would find a cathedral of grand design, an edifice built to worship a double-headed eagle from another era. Within its cool interior was a vaulted ceiling of colored glass, arches, and columns, designs that the plainsmen of Basik had forgotten how to construct. In the time the elders of the various northern kinships met in this temple, only 3 weeks after Sulaway's first summons, there were few of them left. Many of the kinship had never responded to the aging, hand-wound boxcasters, nor had they responded to the secondary smoke signals. Although it had not been spoken, they were already counted among the dead. All the elders waited in reverential quiet, sometimes expressing their concern in hushed tones. The temple was dark, and only pinpricks of sunlight managed to pierce gaps in the rocky crust that covered the windows. The darkness did not matter, for the attention of the assembled elders was centered solely on the single shaft of light at the center of the temple. Captured beneath the beam of an open skylight above was a curious machine piece. All of the elders had seen it before. Some of them had even prayed to it, but never had they used it. There had never, in all their collective memories, been a time that had required it. It just lay there, on the ground, an oblong tin, no larger than a block of compacted nut flour. It was inert, like a sleeping beast, with a thick skin of dust that covered its dials and press pads. And all the time it had been there, no one had dared to touch it. A cranking shaft, delicate and small, protruded from one end of the machine, as if waiting to be turned. Around the machine, a wide circle had been marked in stone, and simple illustrations of armored warriors in bulbous helmets had been scratched onto the floor. They depicted the helmeted warriors slaying a double-headed eagle, smiting it out of the sky with stylized tongues of fire. Like the machine itself, this circle bore no footprints in its dust rind, although the stone outside its circumference had been worn smooth by pedestrian traffic. "Someone has to do it," croaked the toothless elder of the Muru kinship. "Nay, you are older than I, so the honor is yours," rebuked another elder. "Do not be frightened. You are young and vital. You should do it," said another. Soon the congregation were openly shouting, and it became clear that no one wanted to touch the machine. No one knew what it would do. "I'll do it," shouted a young man as he stepped forward. "I'll summon the god spawn." The brave's distinctive plaited hair marked him as a brave of the Kosi kinship, reckless riders of the western plains. No one argued with him as he pushed his way through the assembly and made his way towards the center of the temple. The plainsmen had once worshipped a god emperor in the darkest reaches of their dimmest histories. But that had been during the time of the colonies, a time of dreaming for them, isolated as it was. Hatspasik suffered many raids from alien invaders and human pirates. For a time, the plainsmen had lived fearful lives, constantly nomadic to avoid conflict. But then the Godspawn came to drive away the Xenos. The Godspawn had been their protectors, and so it had always been, as far as the plainsmen had been concerned. The cozy brave took a deep breath and planted a foot inside the carved boundary. The crowd inched back, fearfully expectant, but nothing occurred. Exhaling slowly, the Kosi entered the circle fully and knelt down to inspect the machine. The machine seemed intuitive enough, and there was nothing for the brave to do but turn the cranking handle. Gingerly, he gripped it with his thumb and forefinger, and he started to wind it. To his surprise, it began to turn smoothly, despite its considerable age. He began to turn it faster, feeling the gears within the machine tick over, building up a momentum as a soft purr began to emit from the tin box. With a sudden flash, lights within the temple came alive. Some of the elders exclaimed in wonder, while others screamed and covered their heads. High up in the vaulted ceiling, light they had never known existed flared after 5,700 years of dormancy, lighting the temple with a bright orange radiance. The brave continued to turn, as if he had known all along what to do. The purr became a loud, steady hum. Acoustic resonance thrummed the air, shivering the skin with its building pressure. On the back of the assembly, someone begged the brave to stop turning the handle, but the Kosi could not stop turning, even if he wanted to. The cranking wheel was now spinning on its own, moving so fast the man could not lift his fingers away. Then it stopped turning with a click. The temperature in the room plunged. The breath of the elders plumed white as they waited in expectation. Even the alarmed ones who had screamed now were still. Frost did not exist on Hatspasik, except for when mind witches used their mind powers. But frost now coated the temple, a thin, furry sheet that covered the walls and even the wool of the elders' shukas. But nothing happened, except for the winking sequence of lights that played across the machine's press pad. Nothing happened. The Kosi brave backed out of the circle, and the elders leaned forwards, eager to get a closer look at what work was done. That was when a seismic rumble flattened the entire congregation. A wall of energy pushed them down, and the machine rose up into the air, suspended for a blink before it clattered back down. This time, everyone shouted in fright. The lights winked out, and the temple dimmed, as if a shadow had passed overhead. The elders felt exhausted as they tried to claw their way upright, groping lamely in the darkness. All of them, even the most dim and physically inert, could indistinctly feel what had happened. Although they could not truly understand it, they knew that the power from the little tin machine had been real. I think I had summoned them, the Kosi brave said, staring at his own hands as if they were sacred objects. Oh,